since the turn of the 20th century. In that first book that I finished, I looked at how people's ideas about making men homogenized at the turn of the 20th century by creating an all-American boyhood that ultimately, I argued, privileged whiteness and middle-class identity. And one of the things I did in that work was show how an amazingly broad array of people, young people, old people, black, white, working class, middle class, American-born, foreign, were all drawn into a conversation about how boys became men. But that ultimately, sort of cultural associations between whiteness, class, and gender shrouded a diversity of experiences by which a lot of different young people transversed adolescence during this time period. To be honest, I remain somewhat ambivalent. I didn't think I would be ambivalent about a book after I finished it, but I'm still very, I don't know exactly what I ended up doing. But there you go, it's in black and white anyway. But I remain somewhat ambivalent about that masking, right? I know that because people learned there's this new normal, that now marginalized folks didn't evaporate or accept their lot in this developing social order. So looking into the working lives of boys who were black and caddies at Pinehurst represents my attempt to think about people who were not seen as all-American boys. And I'm hoping to learn more about these people that we have a hard time understanding if we only consider sort of typical experiences. So my starting point today is with a decision made about young African-American boys' moral health by James Tufte, who was at the time Pinehurst's owner and proprietor. He outlawed Sunday caddying because some of his guests thought it was immoral. At various points during the 19-teens, different guests wrote Tufte asking about how the boys were treated, if the work was good for them. And the owner sort of constantly reassured the guests that the boys were cared for according to local circumstances and customs. And he oftentimes said that they were being taken care of in a way that absolved an array of white officials from actually doing what they should have been doing. So educators, doctors, judges, child savers, he basically absolved them of any responsibility for guiding black children by leaving them to the care of their white employers. Working people of color were described as content by Tufte, without the expectations of, say, the region's white textile workers who expected company towns, schools, and churches as the privilege of their whiteness, and were just then starting to form unions to defend their rights. Essentially, Tufte told guests that caddies needed Pinehurst because nobody else was going to look out for them. Right? He needed to have them carrying golf bags because otherwise, well, who's going to make sure they stay out of trouble? So, this question about the boys' well-being took place at a time when Tufte created what became known as the Pinehurst experience. This is sort of like the linchpin of what the resort continues to do up till today. So, at the time, in the early 20th century, it's a month or so over the winter of playing golf, horseback riding, a little ballroom dancing, dinner with other like-minded folk. Pinehurst itself is still to this day described as a village. People get very upset if you call it a town. It is a village designed by Francis Law Olmsted to replicate life in a New England village. The original Tuftes, James Walker Tufte, kind of founded the resort as a place to take consumptive cures. He believed the pine trees in the area would help out people who couldn't afford expensive medical solutions in other places. But it came pretty clear by 1900 that wasn't going to make any money. Golf becomes the linchpin of the Pinehurst experience, and then Tufte sort of spends the next 20 years or so building on that. So a lot, considering those questions from guests that I just mentioned, it's clear that some patrons found it important that whatever problems these youngsters had in life, that it wasn't because they were toting golf clubs around all week instead of going to school or doing the things that they thought made boys into good men, like joining the Boy Scouts, playing baseball, or other forms of wholesome entertainment. And most guests were not particularly interested in actively making the caddies' lives better, but They were also not particularly comfortable with the idea that their leisure might contradict rules that explained black inferiority away with the scientific racism of the day. I think it should also be said that Tufts, a transplant from Massachusetts, was learning the Southern racial caste system on the fly while working to use it to provide for his patrons' needs. For instance, the resort's newspaper, The Outlook, helped build and maintain what historian Richard Moss calls the myth of the happy caddy, an idea he argues diluted any concerns guests had about black employees by telling them that the older black men in the caddy ranks were happy with their long association with the club because they essentially lived to serve, was the argument. This fiction reified what Tufts heard from locals about employing caddies for his customers. It was for their own good, it was his responsibility because unlike white working families, black working families could not be expected to know good morals and should not suffer for breaking rules they did not understand. The happy caddy let golfers know that spending money and enjoying Pinehurst's amenities wasn't contributing to the further degradation of the area's black youths. The Sunday band represented one important way caddying and their identities as working people compromised period and local beliefs and practices governing racial interactions. Within every other facet of Southern life, young caddies were treated as adults and that they enjoyed none of the protections that white children enjoyed. But at the resort, Tufts had to account for the artificiality of categories like age and race and class. And in doing so, he borrowed on a sense of paternalism expected of well-to-do white men and opened opportunities for exploitation that local black leaders were just then beginning to recognize as an opportunity. So, for instance, Tufts had learned that he did have to stay in the good graces of local African-American leaders. There's a small town, still exists today, called Taylortown. It's about a 5-minute drive from Village. And Taylortown was founded by a guy named Nicodemus Taylor. And we're still unclear as to how he came about the money, but we know that he acquired all the property as a black man and then basically developed Taylortown as a black community where would be a place where employees could live and then work at the resort. So Taylortown had a school, and it had what it called a colored community, which is essentially a group of people who are looking to sort of advance the race, improve opportunities in the region for people of color. So Tufts knows that he's got to keep these people happy. His golf professional and head of golf operations, Donald Ross, had to work with Taylortown's educators to create a program wherein the caddy master used only school-aged boys, typically 8 to 16-year-olds, who showed up tagged by Taylortown School, indicating they had been to class that day and were cleared to work. Otherwise, these uplift advocates in Taylortown might disrupt the town's steady flow of caddies to the resort. The program let black leaders manage delinquency among its youth, or at least let the resort off the hook for attracting what they called a bad element in the first place, while giving local black authorities an amount of leverage in their efforts to rid the community of people they thought of as undesirable, who wouldn't go to school, wouldn't go to church, wouldn't generally help people out. By 1920 or so, it's pretty clear that Pinehurst has become a sort of magnet for about 2 or 3 states in the region. People are leaving like Greenville, South Carolina, and going to Moore County because it was better than working in cotton fields, it was better than working in turpentine fields, it was better than a lot of the other options, right? So it's attracting people who have this sort of mindset of, this is a better place to make money, this is a place that might be a little safer for us, this is a place where we can do a little better than we first expected in life. Right? So the first job of these adults who sought to advance the racist cause by saving children was demonstrating that they needed the attention white children received. I mean, literally, they have to demonstrate that children of color were redeemable, and then they had to combat that they were happy caddies. And they had to do this while they were dealing with the practical reality that most of the boys' families need the money. Most of them need their kids' labor to get through the year. So by leveraging the resort's need for young labor with the black community's need to establish that there were options for their kids other than a lifetime of manual labor, these black child savers maintained its student population for longer periods of time and then positioned themselves as an institution of value in Taylortown. The parents got to keep some of their sons' money-making abilities while getting an opportunity to get them an education, and Tufts, of course, got to maintain his labor force in the meantime. So one of the things that's important here, I think, is that Pinehurst only becomes this big resort because even though they disagreed on the end results and the goals of raising these particular groups of boys, they all agreed that it served some end towards self-development, that it did something good for them. What that good was debatable. What it resulted in was questionable, but everybody could at least on paper go, yeah, this is probably pretty good for them, right? Of course, you only had to look around to realize that most of this was hooey. You only had to see the 65-year-old African-American men still toting bags or picking up trash and telling old-timey stories about the good old days just around the time of the Civil War to understand that there really was a lot of fiction being created here. So, it certainly was a problematic deal that these people made. I mean, nationwide, golf had a very well-earned reputation for treating boys as beasts of burden. Generally speaking, caddies walked 18 to 36 holes a day. That's about 8 miles or so. And they did that carrying 2 bags and a variety of weather conditions. The work is demeaning work, right? It means assuming a deferential tone and a lot of responsibility for other people's happiness. It means basically smiling and singing and dancing and telling jokes. In fact, one of the first things the boys were taught on their first day of work was that at the end of the day, all the caddies had to report to the resort's sort of front steps. There's a huge veranda there now. It was there then too, but it looks a little different now. And they basically did a little song and dance act for tip money for like 30 or 45 minutes. Now the boys, when they started, got none of that money. It was the older men who got the cash. But they basically learning, you are a piece of the resort. You are a piece of the entertainment. This is your job. And so it's not the kind of work that teaches you that you have a lot of autonomy, that you have a lot of agency. Now, in the Midwest and in the North, this type of work was typically done by working class boys and middle class boys who were white. But the trade-off was, and this is through the literature and the sort of country club records and newspapers and a lot of newspaper reporting on these guys, is that, well, it's okay to treat these boys like this in Illinois because, you know, they're white and they're basically networking. They're going to get into college, right? They're going to get a job. Yeah, we'll treat them pretty poorly when they're 12, 13, 14, but they know the deal, right? Of course, that option doesn't really exist for this particular group of kids. Caddying was central to golf's identity at the time and to the resort experience as a practice that had sort of migrated from Scotland, where it had always been a working class occupation. In fact, one of the ironies here is that Donald Ross, who's now probably better known for his golf architecture than for a lot of this other stuff, for his playing abilities, teaching ability, was a working class fellow from Dornoch, Scotland. And this resort just sort of made him into a professional sort. I mean, he becomes middle class because the resort becomes so successful because it needed to project a certain image. And so they are using labor of his to say, well, we have an expert, we have a professional. At the same time, they're using the boys to say, and there's also this other sort of labor that we can use to differentiate from good labor, right? Now, certainly a lot of golf scholars emphasize how the sport affirmed certain racial hierarchies. But on the other hand, amateur historian Pete McDaniel suggests that most early black golfers had their only introduction to the game this way. And that, yeah, the work was demeaning, but as I mentioned earlier, it was better than a lot of the other options they had. And that within the black community, that this was seen as sort of an enviable position. Now, the boys themselves seem to have their own goals that took shape from working class identities. Even though none of the scholarship on caddies and race consider their ages as a focal point, it's clear that the boys jockeyed for caddy positions, right? There were other jobs they could get. I mean, they could work in the laundry. They could work basically as a messenger boy in the town. They could do other juvenile jobs. But it was very clear that they all want to be on the golf course. You start off as a shag boy at 8, which means that literally you're standing in a field, sort of driving range, right? So you're standing in a field with a bucket, a shag bag, and a guy's hitting golf balls at you. And you pick them up and you put them in the bag and you bring it back to him, and he kind of tells you where to stand. And you know, if you're really good, you catch the ball in the bucket and keep them entertained and try and earn a little extra tip money. But the road to the really good cash was on the course itself. That's where you had to get. They want to get on the course as quickly as possible because that's a way of building relationships with these seasonal guests who come back like every single year for 15, 20, 25 years. You know, so some of the boys end up having what amount to like lifelong relationships with some of these guests who they're working with the boys when they're 10, and then when the golfer is 70 and the boy is, you know, like 50, they're still working together, right? It becomes a sort of a lifelong occupation for some of these guys. You had to stay in the good graces of a guy named Donald Curry. He's the caddy master. This is a book he built. And he basically took pictures of all the boys. I should mention that at the high point, there are probably about 500 caddies working the resort. This is like in the mid-1920s. I don't know what percentage of them are juvenile, right? I know a significant portion of them are, but a lot of them are adults. And he keeps this book. This is on display at the Tufts Archive in Pinehurst. It's a little difficult to make out the script, but basically he takes their picture and he goes through and he labels them good or bad. Like this one's a good one, this one's a bad one. One of them says murderer under it. You know, if they are prone to thievery, that what he calls thievery, that's noted in the book as well. So he has this sort of tab where he keeps track of the boys and whether or not they're the people who get to go out the most. You've got to keep this guy happy because A, he decides how many times you get out in a day, which means how much money you're going to make. And B, he decides if you stay employed throughout the season. And you wanted to be employed not just because of the cash, but because Tufts also ran a small medical center that you only got if you were a caddy. You only got access to that job. You had a small commissary that you could have lunch provided for you. So there were these other services the kids could get, right? So that meant that the caddies who earned the reputations for good club selection, anticipating the needs of their customers, and remaining entertaining, happy caddies, got the best loops and got out the most. It's pretty clear that these guys are making some economic choices. Oops, wrong button. Here we go. Just a couple of quick examples. I won't spend too much time here, but I wanted to put a couple of names and faces to this. On the left, this is Donald Ross, the head professional, and he took on a guy named Hard Rock Robinson. Hard Rock apparently got his nickname because his favorite treat was candy, his Hard Rock candy. And Ross learned this and would always tip him and pay him and then give him the candy. It was like an extra treat. He was always chewing on it. So here's Hard Rock at about 12. He was Ross's personal caddy. Hard Rock retired in like 2006. And I mean, this guy spent his entire life working at the resort. On the right's a guy named Willie McCrae, and this is a photo from 2005. He just retired last summer, actually. He caddied for almost the entirety of the 20th century and into the 21st. Hard Rock got into Pinehurst because his dad had come up from South Carolina. He wanted to start working and making money for the family. McCrae was forced by his dad to go to work, and he kind of worked at his dad's wills. So these guys, this is kind of the part that I'm still a little icky about. I mean, clearly they stayed caddies their entire lives. Like this whole idea of them improving themselves didn't work out on the surface. Yet, on the other hand, their sons did pretty good. McCrae, his son is actually an assistant golf professional at the resort. In the last several years, McCrae spent a lot of time basically doing PR, telling a lot of stories, none of which you can believe. He's a good guy. I've met him a couple of times, but not a particularly good historical source, unfortunately. So I'm just not sure what to do with these guys. Long story. So just to sort of wrap up this for you a little bit, I think that what I'm doing here in the early stages is that I'm showing up that there's this debate about whether or not it's good for these kids and that debate is rife with self-serving inconsistencies. And that toughs and patrons define people who are not clearly defined as children, legally as children, but of a particular racial and class background that made them employable in ways that white middle-class kids or white working-class kids cannot be employed. I mean, the black child savers had very good intentions, but their efforts to regulate caddies' working hours were really sort of shaped by a middle-class uplift ideology that didn't help these guys out a lot. It didn't really have a whole lot of meaning for them in the short term. And I think the boys themselves seemed happy to play the part of children and happy caddies if it helped their cause. I kind of wondered if this whole school tag plan became something they used. Like, it'd be very convenient to go to school and use that as a tool to get somebody else to sort of limit who could get the job. It would get you more tips if you limited the amount of people who went on, that sort of thing. But they're making some very adult decisions driven by earning potential and building a reputation as skilled workers. And I think that the artificiality of these roles shone through in 1925. And I'm just going to mention this in passing. Tufts basically decides to go back on this no caddying on Sundays deal. He gets enough customers who are going, hey, I want to play on Sunday and I can't do it without a caddy, so why can't we use Sunday caddies? And then another local course started doing that. So he basically polls all the country clubs that he considers superior in the state and asks them, do you allow these boys to work on Sundays? And there was an archaic blue law on the books saying you can't work at leisure on the weekends, on Sundays specifically. And the overwhelming response he got was, well, yeah, just go ahead. Nobody cares. They're black. You got to look out for them somehow, right? So I think that by the mid-1920s, a lot of the adults didn't see working them on Sundays as a danger. And I also think that in this case, class constructed artificial boundaries that were out of step with the working needs of Pinehurst's black community, in distinction to the adult status that Jim Crow South imposed on young people of color in the form of social control. Adults besides parents saw the boys as potential middle-class adults. Boys saw themselves as working-class people who took advantage of a unique opportunity afforded them by timing and geography. And I think that the intersectionality between age, race, and class points to inconsistencies and what people thought was normal for these boys. I mean, nobody's agency is set in stone here. What I'm hoping to sort out as the project moves forward is what impact that lesson might have had on the boys as they grew into men, fought in the Second World War, lived through the resort's decline in the civil rights era and its rebirth in the 1990s and 2000s. But for now, I'd say I'm comfortable saying this, that caddying proved no simple exercise in white supremacy, wherein well-to-do white folks forced black children into labor and a life of servitude. Thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it.
Our second presenter for this panel is Professor Tim Libretti. Professor Libretti is at the Northeastern Illinois University in the Department of English. He will be presenting a paper entitled America's Confederate Art, critiquing the most damaging ingrained class ideologies through an analysis of mainstream supremacist thought in America.
All right, thank you, and thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you. I'm just going to cut to the chase right away about kind of what's on my mind and where I'm coming from. But I'm always looking for new ways to talk about class and, in the spirit of this conference, how it works, and to translate it for students so they really understand these dynamics. And also to teach us, because we often hear at this conference, we don't talk about class in our world. And I always say, we're always talking about it. You just got to listen for the language we're using to talk about it. And I say that because I still have students ask, and I still hear this, well, is this race or class, or is this or that? And of course, the proper response generally is it's dialectical, but it's often hard to talk in a dialectical way, right? How do you talk about all three things at once sometimes? Just the language is difficult. But it's with sort of the rise of, not the rise, but the more recent attention given to white supremacy in America, because of recent events in the presidential election, that led me to think that we could identify something called supremacist thought, right? Which really gets at the ways that we think hierarchically in our world that enforce class society and really normalize it. And I started to notice that when we talk about white supremacy, we think about it as, it's often represented, I shouldn't say, it's often represented as something extreme. These extreme sections, these are the people who think this way in the world, these Trumpites or whoever, rather than seeing it as something incredible, supremacist thought, not necessarily white supremacist thought, but supremacist thought as absolutely mainstream. We endorse a supremacist society in all kinds of ways, and we could talk about class society that way, right? But we have so many assumptions that we are just encrusted in our world that we take for granted that endorse and support and legitimate class society, that even in my discussions with Marxists and progressives are accepted. So for example, where I'll get to in this paper is in part that meritocracy for me, I've come to think in my own study, thinking over time, is one of the most damaging belief systems, right, in our world, and people are bound to it. They believe, many people believe, they deserve more. This question of desert is rather central. Right? I mean, how this has played out in racial politics, but also how we can use the racial discussion or the racial conversation to address the centrality of class and class structure in our world. But we don't typically, as a culture, not we necessarily in this room, interrogate the values that endorse class structure, namely meritocracy. Even when we discuss, so most people don't question the fact that the postal worker makes less than the lawyer, or the Target cashier makes less than the medical doctor. We don't. Even when we have discussions of income inequality, it's not about achieving inequality, it's equality. It's not about ending capitalism and exploitation. It's about moderating it to some extent. And I'm thinking that if we use this term supremacist thought to talk about ways we endorse hierarchy, and just as a quick digression, the novel The Intuitionist by Colson Whitehead, if you know it, which is frequently called a racial allegory, and it deals with this elevator inspector and the notion of elevators going up and down. And Whitehead critiques vertical thought. It's often seen as a racial novel, and I say it's much more than that. Right? It's a critique of how we support hierarchies and ways to sort of think horizontally in ways that are quite different for us. Because I think that our mainstream thinking in ways that just are encrusted in our frameworks of thought, our cognitive structures, is to think hierarchically and vertically, and it frames so many of the ways we think about the world that make it really difficult for us to really get to the heart of class society and issues of exploitation. And even this moral question of desert, what people deserve, I think is rather central. But I'm hoping with the category of supremacist thought, I think even though we certainly have issues with patriarchy in this country and racism, there's still a sense in which people can understand that racism and sexism have an irrational, unjust component to them. At least more people seem to be able to do that. When it comes to the question of class, I would suggest it's much more difficult for people to see that as unjust. Maybe people need a higher wage, but God forbid we think about a classless society. I've even had these discussions with Marxists and progressives who say, no, Marx believed in meritocracy. I said, well, how do you reconcile that with the idea that two German philosophers said in a famous work in the mid-19th century, for each according to his need, from each according to his ability. They did not link what you do in the world with whether or not you deserved access to social resources to live and meet your needs. They did not. We can fight about that, but I just found it hard to argue with that statement. That they said something other than, we don't question this fundamental, often in our world, this fundamental assumption is not questioned, right? That what you do in the world should determine your access to social resources. So this is kind of what I want to talk about. I want to talk about where it came from, because watching, particularly in the summer of 2015, I kind of started writing about this when the Confederate flag came down in the South Carolina Capitol, and this was seen as this sort of historic moment, and I'm not to deny that it wasn't, but there was this sense of those crazy people in the South, right, are finally starting to sort of address this and having to come to terms with this. But while the flag was taken down, it certainly didn't leave the hearts and minds, not just of the South, but of mainstream America. And we like to map our national neuroses onto the South, right? It's these backwards people in the South, which is a problem, right? If you've read Melville's Benito Cereno, for example, if you're a literary scholar, he kind of makes this argument. In fact, just August 1st of that year, there was a a rally in Stone Mountain Park, Georgia, where the sea of trucks and motorcycles carrying Confederate flags rallied, right, in support of that heritage and the ongoing practices of white supremacy. But the risk in the coverage of all that, right, was it makes racism, makes it seem like it resides in this other extreme America, right, the culture apart, even distant from mainstream or dominant US culture, rather than understanding it as it is, I believe, as deeply rooted in the very foundation and center of US culture and society since its inception. And that distancing effect, I think, in that year became especially kind of visible when there was a complete lack of coverage, or I shouldn't say that, sparse coverage of the burning of predominantly African-American churches in the St. Louis area. That was the aftermath of Ferguson. It got very small coverage. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates sort of explains this phenomenon when he writes, "In modern America, we believe racism to be the property of the uniquely villainous and morally deformed, the ideology of trolls, gorgons, and orcs. We believe this even when we are actually being racist." So this belief nefariously works to perpetuate racism. And I just want to say supremacism generally, which is where I want to go, masking the way it already informs cultural norms and social structures, giving us comfort that our democratic society is free from racism and need only be vigilant to protect itself from the racist interventions at the margin. The idea, Coates writes, is that racism lives in the heart of particularly evil individuals as opposed to the heart of democratic society. And he says, this belief is reinforcing to anyone who might from time to time find their tongue sprinting ahead of their discretion. But let's also say that it's at the heart of class society. And that supremacist thinking, not just white supremacist thinking or racial supremacist thinking, is at the heart of class society, that we believe in hierarchy, we as a collective culture. Again, many in our culture tend to see the vociferous advocacy for the Confederate flag and the values it represents as extremism, residing on the margins and apart from mainstream American sensibility. And in fact, in coverage of the Stone Mountain Park, Georgia rally I just talked about, the coverage said, this is the 3%. Right? That's dangerous, right? We don't look at how it's operative elsewhere. So this attitude, I think, constitutes a smug and dangerous evasion of the pervasiveness in American culture of the values and ways of social thought associated with the Confederate flag. And I'm going to talk about those values as supremacism generally, not just white supremacy. And it's worth noting at this rally that, you know, carrying the Confederate flag also stood next to the American flag. Right? And in fact, it was that summer, too, I remember going up on July 4th to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and seeing a pickup truck there with a Confederate flag and an American flag, you know, on the truck. To say this is not a Southern phenomenon, right? Not at all. And I think when we forget to think about sort of that North, and we root and to understand race and supremacism, I think, is deeply rooted in U.S. culture as a whole and central features of the foundation and historical formation and development of the U.S. nation state and our capitalist political economy. And we need to root our understanding of race in the history of labor exploitation undergirding the development of the U.S. political economy. Now, that should seem obvious, right? I'm not saying anything startling. Indeed, after all, right, even discussions around the Confederate flag and its symbolic connection tended to talk about its endorsement of slavery, right, which is, after all, above all, a system of labor exploitation. Yet, as historian Barbara Jean Fields has noted, probably a majority of American historians, she writes, think of slavery as primarily a system of race relations, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. And we constantly hear calls in the U.S. to we need to have a national conversation about race, right? Every time someone is murdered, we need to have a national conversation about race. 15 minutes later, we need to have a national conversation about race. And we never seem to have it. Why is that? It may be, I'm not sure, but I'll suggest maybe that the repeated short-circuitings of this discussion may very well be caused by the failure to understand the functioning of race within the larger context of the U.S. socioeconomic system, which Fields' quote suggests we need to do. Right? If we're not really going to address our class system, we're not going to get to that either. And if we follow Fields, we should recognize we can't fully have this racial conversation without discussing labor, and additionally without discussing the function of race within the larger U.S. socioeconomic system historically and today. And and that would include patriarchy. I want to suggest we see race as part of a larger cultural tendency and insistence on establishing, right? Race is simply part of a larger, I shouldn't say simply, but part of a larger cultural tendency and insistence on establishing relationships of superiority and inferiority, domination and subordination. In other words, it's part of a broader tendency of supremacist thought. We have to face this in our world. We love hierarchy. We continually reproduce systems of domination and subordination in various ways. And maybe starting to address the supremacist tendency is sort of one way to begin to get at this. So I'm not suggesting that we submerge the discussion of race to matters of political economy, labor exploitation, and class inequality, and that such matters become secondary. Rather, I'm asserting that race in the United States is in itself a category that organizes our political economy, that is used to target people of color for labor exploitation, and that it functions as a principle for the unequal distribution of social resources. So I'm suggesting the language in which we talk about race in America needs to encompass these issues. And not that it's secondary, it already encompasses these issues. And the broader conversation about race should indeed lead us into, or at the same time be, a discussion that brings us to the heart of American society. That is, to return to Fields, a discussion about how effective and humane, or how ineffective and inhumane, our system of social relationships and productive relationships are in enabling us to take care of each other. That is, when I say take care of each other, how we produce and distribute goods and services to meet the basic needs of all people, and to take advantage of the creative resources of all people to meet those needs, as opposed to generating mass unemployment, immiseration, and so forth. So just to jump ahead, how might a more layered conversation about race and supremacist thought lead us into a discussion that brings us to the heart of American society? In its most ingrained form, I think we see the commitment to developing relationships of domination and subordination in the deeply entrenched cultural value of meritocracy. The meritocratic ideal holds, as I'm sure you know, I'll just say quickly, that those who are more skilled, more intellectually gifted, more endowed with physical abilities, and so forth, somehow deserve more access to social resources, supposedly because these are superior people who somehow contribute more to the world. That's a capitalist worldview. You create more value in the world, therefore you should get more out of it. Marx did not say this. And by extension, it means those who are less gifted in these ways deserve less, even to the point in our world that they deserve to go hungry, be without housing, adequate health care, and so forth. I would suggest that's a belief at work in our world. And the meritocratic world tends to see these outcomes as just, as deserved, as justice. So while there are efforts to raise the minimum wage or narrow the wealth gap, we don't hear many complaints, as I said before, about differential wages based on what people do in the world. It's fair to say, I think, that central to the dominant American belief system is a commitment to inequality, income and otherwise, and to determining relationships of superiority and inferiority as a means of justifying the unequal distribution of wealth. Now, where I came from on this, during the whole thing with the Confederate flag, I came across this quote by the Confederacy's vice president, who said that the Confederacy's foundation, quote, rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. So not only is the Negro inferior, but because of that inferiority, that justifies his enslavement and exploitation for the purpose of creating wealth for a slaveholding class, right? This is a meritocratic ideal, right? And we use race and gender to determine merit, right? We have historically decided women and people of color are less deserving. They're less capable. This is why they deserve less. But we have to recognize at the heart of even the way we've deployed race and gender, there's still a meritocratic kind of thinking at work. And I think this is important to recognize. Okay. So I want to drink this because we even do this in less interrogated ways in the class system. Rarely do we question terms in our culture as a whole, not you in this room, skilled and unskilled, even paid and unpaid labor, right? I think if we look at conversations around the globe about the basic unconditional income, right? I always ask students, where did this belief come from that what you do in the world or that you work in the world should be connected to your ability to have a human life, to have your needs met, or to have more? Where did that first initial belief even come from? because it's completely, in my mind, unquestionable. But the basic unconditional income begins to delink those two, right? Work and the meeting of your need. That's a basic human right. And to me, that's just a very interesting question. And I think I often hear at this conference when people talk about work, in my mind, they're really talking about jobs. And that's an issue, because there's lots of work that gets done in the world and lots of work that needs to be done that's not paid. And where we really need to go is to sort of, the supremacist ways of thought contains ways of valuing the world and what people do and who they are. And we need to get to the point where we completely think about where our values come from, economically and socially. Those two are vitally linked, I hope I'm suggesting. And if we think about, to return to other racial issues, if we think about Black Lives Matter, this is fundamentally a question of how we decide as a culture how life matters. What matters? How are we valuing people, what they do, who they are? And that should fundamentally lead us. We can move through race or think through race to a larger consideration of, I don't even want to call it our class system. I'll call it a hierarchical supremacist system, to change the language a bit and get us to think about what we're really doing here in our world. And I'm hoping that, my thought is maybe that language will also begin to get people to think about class differently. Because it is so ingrained and entrenched in our thinking that economic hierarchy is just. People are sort of more apt to question, on the whole, racism and sexism and those hierarchies. Not that they don't exist and not that they're not things we need to address. They certainly are. But I think there are many unquestioned assumptions about class, and I don't even want to separate these three necessarily. I want to, again, find a language to talk about it all together as kind of a larger supremacist body of thought. I'm going to just shut up for now and get to conversation. Thank you for your audience.
Well, let's keep talking. So let's have our panelists go sort of come sit together so we can see you and you us and expand this dialogue. I'm just going to open this up with an opening thought. And then, because we have fewer panelists, we have more time for a free-ranging conversation. But in thinking about these two papers together and the role of the American South, of course, we come up against the common binary of subjugation and hegemony and dominance. And we find in Ryan's paper this story where the empowerment of the Jim Crow system as a cultural system, as we all know, of course, expands far beyond the boundaries of Jim Crow, where subjugation is reinstilled in the work that African American people do, and within that, too, a cultural framework of who is a boy or what is a man, and how do we think about those two concepts in regards to work, but also human dignity. And so it's a really interesting paper, I think, that wrestles with whether or not this should be located within a racial uplift narrative, or whether or not this should be thought of in a more broad narrative of the Jim Crow South far after Jim Crow, where all the kinds of systems of subjugation that we see every day in our everyday lives goes unremarked upon. For you, the question that I had is the role of oral history with these caddies, and how they see themselves in the system, or if your work is also doing the oral history of their children, which I was very interested in the fact that you see their role as able to move beyond that of their fathers. But how did they see the role that their father played? You know, I was thinking about the film The Butler, for instance, right? So this person, this mainstay from 1930, you know, in your case of Hard Rock, right, until he retired in 2000. So he's seen these vast changes, but how do they see themselves within the broader history? And then for Tim Libretti's paper, I had worked in Charleston at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture as their public historian. Right at that moment, or soon thereafter, of Dylann Roof. And there was in Charleston a struggle over symbols of the Confederacy, particularly at Hampton Park, where the park named for Wade Hampton, the Confederate general and governor of South Carolina, was also the space that initially African Americans had claimed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, at the moment of emancipation, as Union Park, where they would bury Union soldiers and have every year an annual remembrance of that. So how do we remember questions of difference and questions of opposition? Also importantly, at that same park, that is now where the statue of Denmark Vesey is. And after the Dylann Roof shooting, across Confederate statues in Charleston were inscribed in spray-painted letters, "Black Lives Matter." So how do we take that deeper cultural story that you want to tell of celebrating on the one hand the dismissal and pulling down of the Confederate flag, and on the other those silences of racism that go beyond a Southern framework in places like Ferguson and the church burnings. So I think my question for you is what would a different cultural symbol or process look like that would go beyond this story of hierarchy and dominance? What would that look like, both in a practical sense and in a broader sense? So those are my two questions. You can answer them, or we can take questions from the audience and maybe thread answers within that.
Well, I am happy to go ahead and start the ball rolling, answering the question you've posed, which is, the thing that stuck in there was this question of how do these guys remember themselves as time goes on. I just say, this paper, I conceive of as sort of like the beginning core of a kind of a journal-sized article specifically about the 19 teens and 1920s. But the larger project that I'm looking forward to is like a collective biography of about a half dozen of these people as they aged. One or two of them are still alive. Many of their families still live in the area. It's fairly clear that particularly the Second World War was a turning point of sorts, like how they saw themselves. They get, after they come out of the Depression, an opportunity to do something else arises. They quickly take it. They're like, oh yeah, I'll go over to Fort Bragg, no problem. I'll take my 3 meat a day, and I'll take that opportunity, and I'll take care of that. And when they come back, the way they talk about themselves in a lot of the interview material that's been done with them. I've had some access to basically what's part promotional, part documentary material that's been produced. Some of it just never got used, I think, because they didn't talk the way they wanted them to talk. They were talking about their lives as caddies in ways that the resort couldn't box and put on a flyer, basically. And a lot of what they said was that, what I did was something other people couldn't do. I spent a lot of time acquiring a very specific field of knowledge. I developed myself as a person. I had this military career, and I came back, and I've chosen to do this. Nobody's making me do this. I've chosen to do it because it's a good life. I provide for my family. The guests who I built these relationships with value me as a person. They see me as important, particularly in the post-World War II period when Pinehurst does things like, it hosts the Ryder Cup, which is a big, huge, transatlantic golf event, and it hosts some big name events in those years. These guys are in the New York Times because they're the local caddies caddying for the big-time people who are coming through. And they really build that up, hey, I know stuff that even professional golfers don't know. So there's this claim of respect. And it's particularly for some of the sons and daughters who I've met and talked with, that's something they're very proud of. As my dad did something that normal people couldn't do. It was a physically demanding job. It was tough to keep your mouth shut sometimes, but they helped people do things they would be able to do, whether it was a professional athlete or an amateur athlete, and they sort of parlayed that into new opportunities. So yeah, I mean, I think that when I get back to North Carolina and get back into some of this work, it's been backburnered for a year while I'm taking care of some administrative stuff. I'm going to be buying a lot of beer at Maxie's Pub, which is like the caddy hangout in town. So it's going to be a lot of talking with these guys and getting a sense, but they certainly hold themselves in pretty high regard. You know, they don't see themselves as people who are demanding. They see themselves as skilled workers, and a couple of whom have been able to make fairly comfortable, lives for themselves out of that.
Sure.
Can I just sort of ask about this sort of? I'm British, so I'm not too sure about this sort of north-south divide. I kind of understand it because in Britain we have a north-south divide as well, but I'm not sure if it's the same. But I suppose it's a question for both of you, really, I suppose it's the narratives about the North and the South and how those historical narratives sort of play out today. And then particularly around the flag, and which flag is the good flag and which flag is the bad flag. Because in the UK, I'm an anarchist, so all flag waving is about violence and oppression. And I think, but here in the US, I might be wrong, but I get the feeling that perhaps that's not the case. That the United States, the Stars and Stripes, seems to be a better flag. Am I right, or? And I suppose that's a question for both of you.
Again, it depends on if you're an anarchist in the U.S., I would think you would see both flags, right? So, and if you live in the South, and not all, but there, and again, not even. I mean, you drive through Michigan, you see anywhere, you see plenty of Confederate flags, So, but that those who wave it believe that they are proudly honoring what they call a tradition, a heritage. They don't necessarily call that heritage a racist one, right? And so I wasn't trying to say one flag is better than another. I was actually trying to.
I know you wasn't, but I'm sort of asking.
So, but I would say on the whole, right? Because there is a way of thinking that the Confederate flag, right, is this retrograde, outmoded way of life linked to slavery and racism and so forth. And I don't know. It's hard for me to speak about the meaning of the American flag, but my own suggestion was, right, these values are inherent in sort of the whole national, right, culture.
There are some libertarian movements that take up the flag, right? The civil rights movement and Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I'm really interested
Black Power
in that.
did not. So
Yeah.
The way that the flag and nationalism is exclusive, but it's violent. It's in order to get the Stars and Stripes, it's a violent process.
Mm-hmm.
It's a violent and oppressive process, and it's sort of, we have this debate in the UK because flags in the UK, whether it's the Union Jack or the St George's, which is the English flag, we do feel uncomfortable about them because of our colonial history. And we call the Union Jack the butcher's apron.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we call the Union Jack. That's what I call the Union Jack. But here, there does appear to be a kind of an acceptability around the Stars and Stripes. Is that?
Yeah. The people I know who fly the Confederate flag, and these are neighbors and students. I live in rural North Carolina, right? So I remember because I was driving up I-95 last fall, and somebody had taken a mammoth, probably the biggest Confederate flag. I didn't even know they made them this big. It looked like, those like huge ones they use at like football games. They're like 20 by 30. It was one of these things, and it was up on a pole, and it struck me as we talked about in the second paper, is the idea that people kind of saw South Carolina as, okay, this conversation is now like ended. And that big flag reminded me how it really didn't go anywhere. It just privatized. It just quit being like publicly acceptable. But the people I know who fly the Confederate flag do it because they believe they're actually more American than you. You know, they will fly both side by side, and in some cases, purposefully fly the Confederate flag higher than the American flag because they see themselves as people who are put upon. They see themselves as people who are protecting these like ancestral rights. They don't see it necessarily as better, or one's bad and one's good.
Or protective whiteness, perhaps.
Yeah.
Itself, which is also a foundational concept.
Absolutely.
Wow. Yes.
So thank you both. This is for Tim, and I'm not sure what this is. I think it's a response.
Just do it.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to hopefully get to a question, but so it begins with Stormy Daniels and my anger at the way that she's been treated by the mainstream media, because she's initially was seen as this representation of a, somebody associated with that tainted fringe sex industry thing right over here, and was constantly being referred to as a porn star, which was meant to be humiliating, because of that industry and this sort of D-list celebrity, and then she got finally when she became, she was able to show that she was smart, and was able to respond to questions that changed to adult film actress or something. But what I'm thinking about here, when you were talking about this sort of false equivalency, these dichotomies between supremacist and sort of mainstream thought, I was thinking about how, in fact, the porn industry is absolutely mainstream, It's absolutely mainstream. And from online porn, which makes billions of dollars, to, and so she became, and she still, to a degree, I think, remains, this representative of someone who can those who are enthusiasts of the Confederate flag, they're easy scapegoats. It's like, well, so she's this woman who has something to say, but she's suspect because she's part of this, this industry that is supposed to be seen as oppressive to women, and a totally, just abject kind of work to do, And so I like what you're trying to do with this, but I'm also, worried about, and I know that sometimes we have to do this when we're thinking about things theoretically and abstractly, but sort of when you were talking about how racism and patriarchy are these, these systems of oppression, that are getting at least that we have come to accept, or some people, have come to accept that these are troubling kinds of systems, and that that people who are complaining about them, feminists and Black Lives Matter activists, or civil rights act, that maybe they've got some some reason to complain, and so I see that, but I'm still worried about thinking about class as a separate system, rather than thinking about these as more integrated. Yeah. Because so I think there's some, because I think it's something about equating, if I'm thinking about this, it's like, well, so what happens to Stormy Daniels is not the same as what happens to Black people who leave their house and get shot. Right. That's a different kind of system of domination,
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I don't know.
Well, so a couple of things. So one, it sounds like the dynamic is fascinating. Comment and question or whatever you want to call it. But it seems like with the Stormy Daniels, you're getting how porn is central, yet we deny that it's part of us, and we say it's horrible when people are doing it. Right. I know Rudy Giuliani doesn't really watch it. Doesn't really look at it. But I just want to say, in relation to your last part, is so what you. I think where you're going is kind of where I want to get. I don't want to talk about them separately, I'm thinking, well, maybe the language of supremacy, is a language that dialectically weds them all. And we're thinking about this fundamental tendency to create hierarchies, which is fundamentally what endorses class society. And the only point I was trying to make is, all the stuff you say is true. Clearly there are issues with sexism and racism. People are still fighting against it. We got the Me Too movement. The ERA just passed in the state of Illinois. I remember asking in the 70s.
I remember
right?
working on it in the
Yeah.
80s.
Okay, I remember asking in the 70s when I was a kid, like, why is this hard? So people don't think women are, I remember as a kid, So clearly these things, like, people still don't want to admit this stuff, yet we also at the same time want to say, but we're an egalitarian society. Right? I mean, so it's how we hold this together. And so I guess I was thinking finding a language of supremacy is going to might help us have a language that addresses these fundamental tendencies to organize our world this way. Like, why do we keep doing this? Where does this belief come from? And to be clear about what these values are. And my only point was, I think it's in my mind, and this is an observation, it strikes me when I talk to people as much more justifiable and much less obvious to people why we have economic hierarchies and why people get less access to reefs. And I ask people, but you can't live without that person picking the fruit that puts it in the grocery store. So you depend on that person. Why do you want that person to have a life where they can barely live, right? And since you depend on it and it's vital to you, how do you decide it's worth less? Right? And there are all kinds of ways we can go. I always tell people, well, but I went to medical school. I said, who paid for your public education? We did. Right? The whole point of public education initially was a recognition that we depend on one another and we need to educate people to do the tasks that make our lives possible. Right? And we forget this. Right? So my point was, if we call it supremacism, like a lot of people can say white supremacy, that'll scare them. Right? Like, that's not good.
Yeah.
But class supremacy is fine.
Right.
We don't call it that.
Right.
We call it justice.
Right.
We call it dessert. Dessert is a merit, not like cake, but but where I want to get is where, like, how do you talk about it all at once? And I don't mean to separate it, but it's hard, right? That's why I
again, it's like the building blocks of your idea, right? And you're sort of making a point of separating them. But then I'm just thinking about...
And the Stormy Daniels is interesting because, like, we do deny it at the same time.
We do, absolutely. Yeah.
You were going to say something else, I'm sorry.
No, that was it.
Hi. First of all, thank you both for these wonderful presentations. I actually have a question for Professor Anderson. I was very interested, I think, near the end of your presentation, you said something to the effect of that you weren't sure how to analyze something. You discovered that the sons of lots of these caddies had done rather well. I was wondering if you could expand about that. Is that a result of resistance to their fathers, resisting the bad conditions they were working under, or in spite of it? Was there some kind of opportunity? And perhaps if you maybe haven't been able to get at that in your research, how might you get at it as you go forward?
I haven't been able to get at it yet. But I think that fundamental to understanding these relationships is, what's very clear to me is that the resort is founded on some type of racial tourism, basically. These people are paying to leave Pennsylvania and New York and to come to North Carolina to be in the South and to experience this exotic, and this is in the letters, it's in the advertising material, come to the exotic, foothills of North Carolina and this kind of see this bygone life, but they don't really want to be in the South because they're going to a village that looks like one that should be in Massachusetts somewhere, right? But you saw that sort of advertising slide. It's very clear that they've got the African American boys sitting on the fence saying, we're waiting for you to come, we're waiting for you to show up. So I think that race and different types of class understandings of race in this particular town have always been fundamental to making money. And the resort began creating different and better opportunities for African Americans that were more middle class when it was in their best interest to do so. Right? Post-civil rights, when they needed to demonstrate, hey, look, we're not just treating these guys like beasts of burden. Willie McRae's son is a professional here now, and that shows that we have respect for them. And it's really odd because you can be in this place even today, and there's this sort of uncomfortable silence about, hey, we understand there are all these people of color around here doing all the heavy lifting, and some of the tourists are of color too, right? And so so the sort of dialogue today is like, well, we are better off than we used to be, but like we don't have a language for really understanding this today.
We're diverse middle class, but all the people working as caddies are pretty much still people of color.
No, it's really changed up. Actually, now I couldn't give an accurate estimation, but it's much more diverse now. Now there's enough money in it that there's like a seasonal pattern where these guys will go to North Carolina in the winter and then Northeast in the summer and then spend part of the winter in California. It's like a circuit of guys who travels around. And there's some people who are kind of seasonal work locally, but they're of different colors, different classes. Some of them, like, one of the guys I know who's helped me out a lot he's a small business owner. He's a repair shop in town, but this is like easy cash, to go work 2 or 3 days a week at the resort.
Thank you very much. I thought that racial tourism, I really think there's onto something there, because that also historically would line up with the whole reconciliation narrative that goes on for it's in that period, late 19th century, into the 20th, that, in Birth of a Nation is the great, the culmination of that kind of thing.
Right.
And so this would be a subtler version of that. It's sort of more genteel, representation of basically the same kind of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ultimately based on a kind of a meritocracy. That the whites on each side will get together, united by white supremacism. I mean, it's not stated. Well, sometimes it is, right? In Birth of a Nation, it is. The other thing, this is an anecdote. It's not from Greensboro. There was a Greensboro paper was up there, and my father told me one time late in his life, and this like he would tell me these stories, but he had learned to kind of censor himself in a way, I think, because he knew this is a different time. But he said, sometimes we used to go watch the caddies, and I was like, what? He said, this is in downtown Greensboro. They kind of cross into the African American side of the town, which
Right there,
not very far.
NCAT is.
Yeah, exactly. And, so maybe you know about this. And there was an African American dance club, and the whites, middle class, I don't know if it was middle class or what, but the whites would pay a quarter to go into the balcony and watch the African Americans dance. And a lot of them were caddies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one of those things like, wow, and I think in a way it was like a way to demonstrate your superiority to these sort of inferior, what would you say, like more emotional people, or whereas the rational, intellectual people who would watch them,
Right.
And it was this kind of stunning thing. I was like, I bet he has all kinds of stories like that. He
Yeah.
He thinks I'll judge him or something.
Yeah. And a lot of these kids, like one of the ways they develop this sort of sense of expertise and value is they start playing themselves. And the problem they have is sort of like, well, where do you play? And what ultimately happened at the resort was they started off building what they called a caddy course. They built a little 9-hole course just for the caddies. But at the same time, real estate was developing in the town, and so the homeowners along this piece of land said, oh no, you're not driving the value of my house down by putting that black golf course right there. So what they ended up doing instead was just calling it like an employee's golf course. And that way they didn't have like competition for the regular golf courses and lose money that way. They could just shuttle those guys off onto the regular course. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that the local community has needs, they have things they want to do, and there's a negotiation between like what they can do in town, and they can do it as long as it doesn't butt up too much against this business of tourism. One of the towns today is still really famous, a little place called Jackson Crossing, and there's this tiny little building. It's like a curtain store today. But in like the late 50s, James Brown stopped and played it. And like nobody knew about it for like 30 or 40 years. And then they were actually tearing down one of these neighborhoods, and one of the families came across all these pictures and turned up like James Brown in the caravan cars and everything, playing this little caddy park in Caddy Club.
Yeah, thank you. 2 terrific papers. Just really quick comments. One, it just tells how much I appreciate just like putting supremacy at the center, just as the violence of the capitalist system, because you can, sometimes the working class can get into this sort of like nostalgia narrative. We just sort of like Sherry Lincoln's book of like, there's pride in industrial work, and bring it to Stormy Daniels, right? It's a different industrial work, right? They're like, the way that, right, you see that sort of violence, that violence at the center. And just really quickly to Ryan, just kind of really quick questions. Just so I just understand, for the caddy system, is this part of the formal or informal economy? But I'm just wondering, is this all tip or is there wages? So in that sense, do African American caddies, are there any worker protection, or if they hurt their back, do they get delinked from Social Security? And maybe just one of the things, just sort of thinking about, right? You said there's like those two different narratives for white caddies and African American caddies, but for white caddies, there's this understanding, like this sort of like normative narrative that like it's development's about networking and it's going to lead you to a better job. This like this development narrative it makes you think about who can ideologically occupy childhood, right? This idea of like a caddy would be a caddy for life, which does link to Black Lives Matters, right? Yeah. The inability of the mass media to say like Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, they were kids, right? They weren't recognized as kids, right? So there's also ideological work of being recognized, like as a kid, there's also our labor laws being broken. They shouldn't be working, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So the way they don't occupy this category of like of childhood, so there's so much theoretical richness there. That's interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, in the work I've done so far, the guys make money two ways. One, they do get a small wage.
Oh, there's one.
It's like $2 a day, and then the tip money is really where it's at. Right. The tip money is the extra money. So these days, the resort actually doesn't run the caddy business themselves. They are contracted. They are contractors. They're not employees of the resort any longer. There's one guy in town who runs all of them, and you got to be in good with this guy to get caddy jobs in town. And he manages to supply, entirely. Yeah. But I know that about it. I don't know too much more about kind of the wage tip situation these days.
But if there's a labor injury, then there's no protection, right?
No, they're independent contractors.
Right?
Yeah, sorry, bud.
Yeah.
Can I
say the risk?
Something quickly about this question of violence that you brought up? Because at one point in that paper, I said we map our national neuroses right onto this flag, and we don't. There's a psychological study that needs to be done of our need to hierarchize, and Ryan's my buddy, and we talk a lot. We work together. He once said to me, we were talking about slavery, and I was like, I didn't like some representation, but it doesn't show slavery as a system of labor exploitation. And Ryan's like, there's more to it than that. Where would that violence come from, right? Which got me to think, right? There's something much more going on. I'm thinking about this book, 16 Tons, that Charles just got, which is about, if you know it, it's an incredibly violent book about the coal strikes in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And like the war waged on these people that is like, we will kill you before we pay you money more. I mean, it's horrible, right? And I'm just struck when I read that book at the intense violence. And it says, this has to come from some other psychological thirst, right, that undergirds this. And I don't have much other to say about that other than I think we have to recognize if we start to talk about, well, where does the tendency to hierarchize come from? That we live in a very punitive culture. We love to punish people. We love to talk about what people don't deserve. Right? We need to say all kinds of untrue things about people, like they're lazy, this or that, to justify it. And there's a violent, even in that thought, there's something that exceeds, right, mere I just want to have a sandwich and have someone make it for me, right? There's something beyond that. And I think as we get to the root of like how class works, how patriarchy works, how racism, like there's this deeper psychology we have to understand. My own suspicion when I think about hate and I think about like people that voted for Trump because he's so abusive, usually by people who have experienced a great deal of abuse in their lives in our system, right? And you know the psychology of abuse, you might identify with the abuser if you do not work that out, right? And if we don't like think about this kind of trauma underlying, it's like what accounts for this? And like it's really, particularly when I read that novel 16 Tons, like this is insane, right? It is like insane to me. And like, where the hell does that come from? That's all. I was just compelled to say that.
Roman.
Thanks. Thank you both for the papers. My questions are for Ryan. I'm wondering, I'm trying to think about this, but what you're saying about racial tourism reminds me of Orientalism and of slumming in urban areas, and I'm wondering, like, the link between racial tourism and nostalgia for some kind of imagined past.
Yeah.
So, like, in urban areas, for people who were touring, like Chinese communities in New York, for example, they're constructing an entire past that never really existed in their minds. And I'm wondering how much you see of that in this kind of like nostalgia. I mean, you mentioned the town is patterned after a New England village rather than any kind of town that would have existed in the South. And then two, I'm wondering about the geographical mobility of the caddies themselves. Do they all come from that community, or are they coming from outside to get those jobs?
So I'll start with the second question first and then backtrack a little bit. They are coming from, some of them are local and some of them are moving from somewhere else. It's within about, golf's introduced in 1900, and by 1910 it's clear that people have word of mouth, they've heard, there's a bit of mobility in that region, which makes sense. I mean, there are people, if you grow up in that region and you're working agricultural labor, you have to follow work, right? And you've got these family networks and church networks that can keep you informed. So you're moving around the region looking for the, most acceptable bosses possible, right? So it's pretty clear that, like, word of mouth, people find out, hey, this is a place where you can go make a little cash. One of the problems that Taylortown had was that it was transient. It's one of the problems that people who were trying to build schools and provide these sorts of services run up against. Is like the town swells in the winter when the season's on between November and April, and then it empties in the summer because no guests in the summer. So part of this.
Those are the kinds of things too that prevent labor organizing, which I doubt you see in your documents, but if you do, I'd be curious.
Yeah, no, I have seen nothing like that. Absolutely, yeah. I think they just sort of assume it's easy to use these guys because we don't have to worry about it. And the first question was about this sort of imagined past. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of quickly referenced it in the paper, but there's an entire issue of this newspaper that Pinehurst prints for itself, the Outlook, in 1926, and it's called The Caddy Issue. And if you look at this thing, you would not think anybody under 50 worked at the resort. It's all elderly men. One of the guys is named Tom Cotton. It's very much like Song of the South type stuff, right? Cotton hair, he's got a bag, he's got a stick he picks up stuff with, and they're talking about all these fond memories. Oh, people love Cotton and his songs from the good old slave days and his stories. And how many of us have grown up here at the resort playing pranks on Tom and getting him angry and riled up at us and then running away laughing? It's very much this like Dunning School sort of interpretation of what's happened in the past. And this newspaper gets sent to guests out of state. I mean, when you go and you sign the register, they just start sending it to you. So it's year round. So it's really odd. It's these people who want to go down and now see the South, but not really. But they're also creating this fiction that is totally out of step with the reality of what's going on at the moment. And there's some people who are clearly struggling with that. I mean, there are guests who are writing and saying, I want to raise money for a working school bus so the boys don't have to walk to work in the morning. We'll take them to school and then we'll drive them to their job. Another one who wanted to raise money for a school. We ought to be building a school for these boys. And are they housed on the premises? So there's some people who recognize the dissonance. And they recognize that these boys are not getting the treatment as workers that they probably deserve. But because they're out of state, they're not there constantly. Because the labor force is shifting so much, it's very difficult for them to pin anything down. I don't think the workers become local and permanent until the 1950s.
Yeah. And then you said too that. Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions, but you said too that you weren't sure how old all the workers were. Were they all called boys regardless of how old they were?
Oh, yeah, they're all boys.
And how long did that tradition, exist through the 80s and 90s?
Yeah.
Oh, no. You wouldn't see that. You wouldn't see that late. I would guess that up through the 50s and 60s. you would see boys use.
I'd be surprised if it was longer than that.
Well, let me differentiate between public and private.
Yeah.
Publicly, the resort was very comfortable calling all of them boys
For a long time.
for a long
Yeah.
time. But publicly, and today if you go to the Pinehurst, website, they basically replicate all this stuff just via blogs. They put up a blog about life with the caddies these days. They founded a caddy hall of fame and inducted all these guys into the hall of fame, and then they basically did it for like 2 years. They ran out of old guys to honor, and they kind of quit doing it at that point. But of the dozen people, 11 of them are African American, only one is white. They're all the guys who were kind of pre-World War II workers at the resort.
I have a question for Tim. Just sort of thinking about the way the supremacist thought comes to be and comes as a sort of convincing, persuasive thing for people, and its relation to inequality. I'm curious at how that type of collective narrative of supremacist thought is compatible with what is actually at the center of it, which is greed and selfishness, right? I'm curious about your thoughts on how those seem to work together to create these narratives.
That's pretty interesting. So, I don't know. That's how I'm going to answer your question. I'll just do what good students do. They may get their own question. Because I would sort of look at it. So, I guess on one level, those are two separate things. I guess I'm thinking from a rhetorical perspective, like calling it what it is, which I think it is supremacist thinking, might be rhetorically effective for certain audiences to work through what are ingrained thinking about class, or less question thinking about class, because they think, well, it's just normal, right? When it comes to greed and selfishness, I think that, I don't know, that may be a different discussion, but I like to say that when I think about things like greed and selfishness, and people say, well, people are just selfish, that's why we have capitalism or so forth. Capitalism produces the selfish self, right? It's a production of the system, and it seems to me to argue, right? I was talking about this morning. I mean, go to the Great Depression and say, wow, people were standing in bread lines hungry. Wow, milk was being poured down sewers, crops were being destroyed, cattle were being slaughtered, right? Does that system make sense to you? Does that system seems like it serves your selfish interests, right? And say, because it doesn't seem to make sense on one level. It seems like, I don't know that we've really had a conversation like that as a culture where we've put things in perspective. Like, if you want your needs met, what's the best way to do that? And we haven't had that larger question about what we might call enlightened self-interest, or what really constitutes your self-interest. And I just think when it comes to selfishness and greed, and this maybe gets to this psychological component, and maybe to the question about supremacy, let me try to link them. Because I also have this other thought often that we frequently pose people in the world as liabilities rather than assets. And I think about the work of Anzi Yazerska, that's someone I love if you study literature. And she has a book called The Bread Givers. And she will often talk about workers and people as givers. What do people give? And we don't tend to look at the world in terms of what people give. Right? And I think to shift that mindset would change this conversation about selfishness and greed, perhaps. I don't know. But, you need to put it in the context of, I don't want to say free college education. I don't like to talk about that, but publicly supported college education. And think about, I don't know, I'm going with that. I'm just going to shut up for now. But
We are just about at time, but we did have one hand up. So if you
I
want
was just going to say, where you'll see a very different way of thinking is in welfare rights or activist work, where it's no, these are the mothers bringing children into the world, which is a giving, but normally the welfare mother is a taker, or a liability.
Right.
It's like, no, are you saying that a person's only worth what they produce, and we might say what surplus value they produce, your relationship. So it's really, that's a place to sort of really think about another way to see human beings in a profound way.
Just quickly, there's a moment in William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, if anybody reads early Puritan work. And he tells the history of the Plymouth Plantation. But there's this moment where he talks about the end of common property. What's the name of the chapter? You know, anyway. And he says, well, the young people noticed that they were doing all the work and these old people weren't doing anything and they got pissed off. So we stopped the common condition. And I always think to myself, like, damn, but you got to get to the end of the history in the next generation, right? Like, you didn't finish the story. What if you see these young people get old and it's like, could you help me out? You know? And, you know, begin to think about that historical trajectory differently. And I remember when I was taught that at university, and you know, the professor said, yes, this is why we don't have communism. I'm thinking, what the hell? You know? And being like, you didn't finish the story. You can't look at it.
I think I'm going to end the session here, although people can continue to ask questions. I just want to thank the panelists. And I also want to say, I can't believe we, as a child of the 70s, spent 2 hours talking about hierarchy, supremacy, and caddies, and nobody ever brought up Caddyshack, Bill Murray, or Adam
I was so
Sandler.
prepared for that,
Oh my God.
The tone if I did it. I was thinking about Caddyshack.
Cinderella story.
That was a working class lad who was trying to get into college through the
Exactly.
You got to make Judge Smells happy.
He's Irish though.